Okay, this video is going to discuss how evolution happens. So since we've gone through the evidence that we know evolution has happened, the next point is trying to figure out what causes changes over time. The first scientist to really put together a significant hypothesis on how organisms changed over time was Lamarck, and his hypothesis kind of had three parts to it. He described in nature and noticed in nature that it seemed like organisms are very nicely adapted to their environment, and that overall there seemed to be a tendency towards getting more perfectly adapted. That was the direction he thought evolution was going. His hypothesis really consisted of two parts on the change piece. One was that organisms either use a trait or don't use a trait during their life, and if they use it, it gets developed more. Like if you're a bodybuilder and you work out, your muscles are going to get bigger. At the same time, if you don't use a trait, your body parts might underdevelop. Or, for example, if you don't use your mind, if you're a couch potato and you're not going to college, this disuse would make your brain a little bit less intelligent than others. He thought what you did during your life then could be passed on to your offspring. He came up with the phrase inheritance of acquired characteristics. Inheritance meaning to pass on to the offspring, and acquired means you basically got it. So kind of reread the statement is characteristics that you get can be passed on to your kids. So if you ask Lamarck to describe, well, how did giraffes get a long neck from short-necked ancestors? Well, you say, well, they spent their lives trying to reach leaves on the trees, and they were stretching their neck. And that stretching of the neck was somehow transmitted to their offspring, and their offspring would be born with a little bit longer neck. Let's see if I can do that a little bit longer. And they would spend their life stretching for leaves on a tree, and you repeat this for many generations. What you get is today's giraffes, which long necks, long legs, long everything to help them get their food. Because what parents did during their life, which is the use of their neck, was inherited, passed on to their kids, and repeating over many generations causes the evolution of giraffes. Well, now, of course, Lamarck was wrong, because we all know now that what you do in your life or don't do doesn't change your DNA. So just because a giraffe stretched its neck its whole life doesn't change the DNA that's in the sex cells. And when the giraffe reproduces, the baby's genes aren't going to change at all. So that hypothesis was out. The scientist that actually figured out how evolution happens was Charles Darwin, and he named his theory natural selection. Natural selection basically works on three ideas here, and they kind of break down to be that one, in any population of individuals, you're going to have genetic variation. That could be between two humans, that could be between two squirrels, two oak trees. All organisms in any species aren't going to be the same because mutations exist in a population. And the other truth about life out there in the world is that there's a struggle for survival. Each generation, nobody comes through and hands an organism the food it needs, the places it lives, protects it from predators. So there's always some sort of a struggle for survival with organisms each generation. Well, if you put these two factors together, what you get is the mechanism of natural selection. What happens is each generation, the best adapted organisms survive. Who survives, who's alive at the end of a generation isn't a random process. It's the organisms with the best adaptations. Giraffes with the longest necks would be the ones that were surviving, and they would pass those traits on to their offspring. So if you have a process where every generation there's a struggle, and because all the organisms aren't exactly the same, what you're going to get at the end of each generation is the best of the individuals surviving, whether that's long necks, fast speed, high intelligence, camouflage. And if you repeat this process, and we call this overall natural selection, for thousands, millions of years, you get change over time, which is referred to as evolution. If you wanted to break that example down a little bit more specifically, for the giraffes, for example, saying how to describe evolution by natural selection, you'd say, taking the genetic variation principle for giraffe height, their ancestors, I'd say that not all giraffes are the same height. In any population of giraffes, if you go out there to Africa and survey 1,000 of them, they're not all going to be the same size, and that's because of genetic variation, or at least much of it is. Somehow in their genes have influenced how tall they grew. The food for giraffes, so the struggle for survival for giraffes is their food is on trees. So in their struggle for survival, it turns out that number 3, the best adapted giraffes, which are going to be the tall giraffes, they get more food because they can reach higher on the trees and eat the leaves. The short giraffes end up getting less food, which means they're going to have a harder time surviving, maybe not survive quite as long, maybe even die before reproducing. That's supposed to be a sad dead face, I guess. Whereas the tall giraffes are going to get more food. They're going to live longer, and if you live longer in nature, odds are you're going to have more kids, and you're going to pass on the good traits of being tall. So what you see then is 1, 2, 3 working on the giraffes. You get evolution of them over time. From a random population of different sizes in the beginning of giraffes, some shorter ones, some medium ones, some of the taller ones, what's going to happen is the shorter ones aren't going to be able to survive as easily. The taller ones are going to be passing their traits on to their kids. So that's natural selection. Well, that was a real tall one. 3-legged giraffe. And then each generation, the tallest of the tall, so this guy is probably our tallest there, is going to live the longest, have the most kids, and pass on their good traits to their kids. In time, there's also random mutations that happen in a population that maybe, 100 generations in, maybe you have a giraffe that's, a little bit more taller, that looks real tall, but a little bit more taller on average. Well, that guy's going to have the advantage from that mutation and then start having the most kids passing on that trait. And so what you get over time with genetic variations introduced by mutation, the struggle for existence, that is trying to find your food on trees in the case of giraffes, you get the best adapted surviving, which is going to be the tall ones. The short ones are going to be dying off, and over time you're going to have giraffes follow the trend of getting taller and taller. And this trend continues until their environment change. If those tall trees, for some reason, get killed off by insects or something, being tall is not going to be an advantage for giraffes anymore, and evolution will start selecting them a different way.